The first sound in the shop wasn't the bell. It was the jagged, visceral rip of ancient paper. Jeremy Adams stood by the rare edition shelf, his hand closing around the spine of a first edition classic like a predator claiming its kill. He didn't just pull it, he yanked it with a casual brutality, the aged leather binding groaning in protest before hitting the floor with a dull, heavy thud. Dust motes danced in the wake of the impact, settling on the ruined gold-leafed edges. Sarah Jakes watched from the counter, her hands steady against the scarred mahogany. Her eyes didn't flicker to the ruined book or the 100-year-old history now splayed across the floorboards. Instead, they were fixed on Jeremy's chest, specifically on the rhythm of a heart that beat inside him only because of a miracle he didn't understand and had never bothered to ask about. Jeremy looked around the cramped bookstore with visible disgust. To him, the shop was a graveyard of obsolete thoughts, a collection of dead trees in a digital age. His tailored suit, a charcoal silk that cost more than Sarah's annual inventory, was a sharp, jarring contrast to the warm scent of cedar, beeswax, and shifting dust. "This block is becoming the Adam Heights luxury wing, Sarah," he said, his voice as polished and cold as a marble floor. "The blueprints are drawn, the cranes are booked, and your lease is an oversight I'm fixing today." He stepped toward the counter, his movements calculated and efficient. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed a thick legal document onto the counter. It landed hard, splashing into the saucer of cold Earl Grey she had been drinking. Sarah watched the brown liquid bloom across the official state seal like a spreading bruise, but she didn't move to save the paper. "Sign the surrender of the lease," commanded Jeremy, leaning in until he was close enough for her to see the flecks of ice in his gray eyes. "Sign it now, or I'll have the city inspectors here by noon. This building will be condemned by sunset, and you will leave with nothing but the clothes on your back." Sarah looked down at the tea soaking into the legal jargon, the ink beginning to bleed and blur. She finally looked up, her expression not one of fear, but of a devastating, quiet pity. "You've spent your whole life tearing things down, Jeremy. You see a wall and think of the wrecking ball. You see a tree and think of the timber." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to carry the weight of the thousands of books surrounding them. "Don't you ever wonder who kept the world standing while you were falling apart? Don't you ever wonder whose breath filled your lungs when you couldn't find your own?" Jeremy's hand twitched, a phantom pain flickering across his chest where a surgical scar was hidden beneath his fine shirt. For a second, the arrogance wavered, replaced by a hollowed, gnawing silence, but then the mask slid back into place, harder than before. "I don't believe in wonder, Sarah," he snapped. "I believe in ownership, and I'm taking this room." The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and steel, perched so high above the city that the streets below looked like nothing more than veins of cooling lava. Yet, despite the expansive view of the horizon, Jeremy Adam felt the walls closing in. He slumped against the floor-to-ceiling window, the cold glass pressing against his forehead as his lungs hitched in a jagged phantom rhythm. The air in the penthouse was ultra-filtered, climate-controlled, and sterile, but to Jeremy it felt thin, a suffocating reminder of the years he had spent tethered to an oxygen tank. He remembered the haze of pulmonary fibrosis, the way the world had blurred into a gray smear while he gasped for a breath that wouldn't come. With a trembling hand, he unbuttoned his bespoke shirt, the silk sliding away to reveal the truth he hid from the boardrooms and the cameras. He traced the jagged silver line that bisects his chest, a raised map of a war he had nearly lost. 7 years ago, a miracle had arrived in a sterile cooler, delivered by silent couriers in the dead of night. A mystery donor had snatched him from the precipice of a shallow grave, granting him a second act he hadn't earned. To Jeremy, that debt wasn't a gift, it was a stain. It was a lingering vestige of a weakness he refused to acknowledge, a crack in his armor of self-made perfection. He hated the thought that his heart beat at the mercy of another's tragedy, that his very existence was a line item on someone else's balance sheet. "I don't care what the privacy laws say," he hissed into his phone, his voice regaining its razor edge as he paced the length of the Italian marble floor. "I want the donor's records on my desk by morning." He stopped at the wet bar, pouring a glass of amber liquid he wasn't supposed to drink, his reflection in the mirrored backsplash looking haunted and hollow. "I want a name, an address, and a price," he continued, his grip tightening on the phone until his knuckles turned white. "I am done living another day with my life belonging to a ghost. I'm going to find whoever is left of that family, write a check that silences them forever, and bury this debt for good. I will not be a ward of fate." He hung up, the silence of the penthouse rushing back in, heavy and expectant. He looked back toward the window, thinking of the bookstore he had just tried to crush. Sarah Jake's eyes had looked at him as if she could see right through the silk and the scars, straight to the borrowed heart hammering against his ribs. He took a jagged breath, the kind only a healthy man could take, and felt a cold, inexplicable shiver. The street outside Bookhaven had become a tomb of jagged plywood and rusted nails, a skeletal remains of the neighborhood Sarah had spent a lifetime anchoring. Jeremy Adams stood amidst the construction debris, his polished Italian leather shoes gathering a fine coating of pulverized brick and drywall. He watched with a clinical, detached satisfaction as his crew hammered the final boards over the storefront windows, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud sounding like nails into a coffin. Safety violations, he had told the press earlier that morning, his voice a masterpiece of manufactured concern. But now, standing in the shadows of the alley, his eyes told a different story, one of a man hungry to see a sanctuary crumble, driven by an irrational need to erase the one person who looked at him without blinking. He stepped through the heavy oak door, expecting to find Sarah Jakes weeping in the darkness, broken by the weight of her dying dream. Instead, the soft, melodic cadence of her voice drifted through the gloom, pulling him toward the back of the shop. She wasn't cowering, she was sitting on a low wooden stool, the amber glow of a single flickering flashlight illumining a small circle of wide-eyed local children. They sat on the floor, ignoring the dust in the boarded-up windows, anchored entirely by the story she was weaving. Jeremy's jaw tightened at her composure. The sight of her piece felt like a personal insult to his power. "This is a construction zone, Sarah," he barked, his voice echoing off the empty high shelves. "Your defiance is moving past stubbornness and becoming an expensive legal liability. I have the injunctions ready. I'll sue you into the dirt before the week is out, and I'll make sure you never hold a lease in the city again." Sarah didn't look up from the dog-eared page of the book in her lap. She finished the sentence she was reading, her voice steady and warm, before she finally closed the cover. The children looked at Jeremy with a mixture of confusion and resentment, but Sarah remained unruffled. "You think numbers on a ledger can break me, Jeremy?" she asked softly. She stood up, handing the flashlight to one of the older boys and ushering the children toward the back exit where their parents waited. Only when the door clicked shut did she turn to meet his cold gray gaze. Her expression didn't hold a trace of the bitterness he expected. Instead, it radiated a terrifying, quiet peace. "I've already given away the most valuable thing I ever had, Jeremy," she said, stepping into the sliver of light that managed to peek through the cracks in the plywood. "You come here with your threats and your lawsuits, trying to take a pile of bricks and paper. But you're late, Jeremy. You can't threaten a person who has already stood at the edge of the world and given everything away. You can't take what isn't there to lose." Jeremy felt a sudden sharp pang in his chest, a ghost of the old pain, or perhaps something new. He opened his mouth to retort, to crush her with a final ultimatum, but the words died in his throat. For the first time, the Adam Heights empire felt like a house of cards, and the woman in front of him felt like the wind. The fluorescent hum of the investigator's office was a low electric drone that felt like a physical weight against Jeremy's temples. Jeremy Adam didn't sit. He stood over the desk, his hand trembling slightly as he snatched the heavy manila folder from the investigator's grip. He already had his checkbook splayed open on the desk, a custom fountain pen poised like a dagger, ready to strike a line through the last debt he would ever owe. He wanted to buy his soul back, to settle the account with whatever ghost was currently haunting his ribcage. "Give me the name," he snapped, his voice tight and breathless. His thumb hooked under the adhesive seal of the folder, tearing it with the same ruthlessness he had shown the books in Sarah's shop. "I want this transaction closed by morning. I want the family's routing number, their address, and a non-disclosure agreement drafted before the banks open." The investigator, a man whose face was a map of other people's secrets, didn't look up. He didn't even reach for the check. He simply leaned back in his creaking chair, his eyes fixed on the rain streaking the window. "It's not a transaction, Mr. Adam," he said quietly. "It's a legacy, and I don't think your pen is big enough to sign for it." Jeremy ignored him, flipping the cover open. His eye scanned the first page, the clinical jargon of blood types and tissue matching blurring until a single name leaped off the medical file: Miller. Specifically, David Miller. Jeremy's breath hitched, a jagged, hitching sound that rattled in the very lungs he was reading about. David Miller had been 22 years old, a student and a poet, declared brain dead following a black ice accident on the very night Jeremy's own organs had begun to fail. But it was the next of kin line that turned the blood in Jeremy's veins to ice. Legal guardian and representative, Sarah Jakes, née Miller. Tucked behind the cold, sterile surgical report was a piece of pale blue stationery, its edges slightly yellowed. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same elegant, steady script he had seen on the close sign at the bookstore. "To the recipient," the letter began, Sarah's voice echoing in the ink, resonant and haunting. "I have requested that this remain strictly anonymous. I am not giving you a piece of my brother so that you can carry a burden. I don't want your gratitude, and I certainly don't want your money. I want you to breathe. I want you to walk through the world and see the things he never got to see. I want you to live a life entirely free of debt, because a gift isn't a gift if it comes with a bill. Just live. That is payment enough." The fountain pen slipped from Jeremy's fingers, rolling across the desk and staining the wood with a blot of expensive blue ink. The silence in the office was deafening. He looked down at his chest, the expensive silk shirt covering the silver scar, and for the first time in his life, Jeremy Adam realized he was holding a fortune he could never possibly repay. He hadn't been bullied by a shopkeeper. He had been kept alive by a woman he was currently trying to destroy.
The silence in the penthouse was no longer a luxury of the elite. It was a vacuum, a hollow space where the air felt too thin to support the weight of his own existence. Jeremy Adams sat motionless at his vast mahogany desk, the clinical manila folder trembling in his grip like a living, breathing thing. The expensive Italian lamp cast a harsh, unforgiving light over the medical files, illuminating the name David Miller until it seemed to sear itself into his retinas. The very air he drew into his lungs, the steady, rhythmic expansion of his chest, felt suddenly and violently stolen. Each breath was no longer a right of the powerful, but a heavy, stolen mercy. He looked down at his hands, the skin tanned and healthy, and felt a wave of nausea. For weeks he had used the very vitality Sarah's brother had gifted him to scream at him, to dismantle his sanctuary, and to threaten her with a ruin she had already survived in its purest form. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and the memory of their first confrontation in the bookstore hit him with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the scent of cedar and the jagged rip of the paper as he had desecrated his shelves. He remembered how Sarah hadn't flinched when he towered over him in his $3,000 suit. He had mistaken her stillness for weakness, her silence for submission. Now the memory shifted, replaying in the agonizing light of the truth. He remembered her gaze drifting specifically to his chest, not with the terror he had tried to instill, but with a haunting, maternal recognition that transcended the wood and glass between them. She hadn't been looking at a predator or a billionaire developer. She was listening to a heart she used to tuck into bed at night. She had been watching the rise and fall of a chest that held the only piece of her brother left on this earth. Every step, he whispered to the empty glass-walled room, his voice cracking into a sound he didn't recognize as his own. Every single step I took toward that shop, every word I used to threaten her, it was all powered by her. The realization was a slow-motion collapse. He looked at the blueprints for the Atom Heights spread across his desk, the cold, sharp lines of the luxury wing that was supposed to stand where her memories lived. The blue ink blurred as the weight of an unpayable debt finally crushed his silver-tongued ambition. He had spent his life believing that everything had a price, that every soul could be bought and every lease could be broken. But Sarah Jakes had signed away for grief to give a stranger a second chance, and Jeremy had used that chance to try and break her heart a second time. He stood up abruptly, the heavy chair skidding across the marble. He didn't grab his coat or his phone. He grabbed the folder and the letter, his heart, David's heart, hammering against his ribs with a frantic, demanding urgency. He didn't need a legal surrender anymore. He needed a confession. The roar of the bulldozers rattled the glass of Bookhaven, a mechanical, guttural growl that signaled the finality of the end. The heavy yellow machines stood like prehistoric beasts at the edge of the curb, their iron teeth ready to tear into the cedar and dust. A crowd had gathered behind the police tape. Neighbors, students, and old men who had spent decades in Sarah's aisles. Their shouts
of protest muffled by the relentless thrum of the engines. But the chaos stilled, falling into a sudden, vacuum-like silence as Jeremy Adams' black sedan pulled to a sharp, aggressive halt in the center of the construction zone. The foreman stepped forward, hand raised for the signal to begin the first strike, but Jeremy stepped out of the vehicle with movements that lacked his usual predatory grace. He didn't arrive with the cold, victorious smirk of a conqueror coming to survey his spoils. Instead, his face was as pale as the bleached medical files currently sitting on his mahogany desk, his eyes wide and haunted. Instead of signaling the foreman to drop the bucket, Jeremy ignored the blueprints held out to him. He climbed onto the hood of a nearby car, his fingers trembling with a visible, violent tremor as he gripped a megaphone. "The Atom Heights luxury project is dead," his voice, amplified and distorted by the electronic speaker, cracked across the pavement, cutting through the stunned silence of the crew and the protesters alike. Effective immediately, all demolition is canceled, all contracts are voided, clear the street. A confused murmur rose from the crowd, but Jeremy wasn't finished. He stood atop the car, his expensive suit rumpled, looking like a man who had finally woken up from a fever dream. He turned his head toward the battered storefront, where Sarah stood in the doorway. She was framed by the plywood he had ordered nailed shut, her hand pressed flat against the ancient wood of the doorframe, as if she were feeling the building's very heartbeat, or perhaps a heartbeat she recognized from somewhere else. Jeremy looked directly at her, the megaphone lowering slightly as his voice softened, though it still carried to the back of the crowd. In its place, he announced, his voice thick with a sudden raw emotion, "I am establishing a permanent, irrevocable endowment for this bookstore. It will never be moved, and it will never be sold. Furthermore,
I am diverting the entirety of the Adam Heights Investment Fund into a foundation for organ donor awareness and family support. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving with a breath that finally felt like it belonged to him. The foundation will not bear my name. It will bear the name of the man who truly built the future of this city, David Miller, Sarah's brother. The crowd erupted into a confused, joyous roar, but Jeremy didn't hear them. He climbed down from the car, his legs feeling heavy and human, and walked toward the threshold of the shop. He stopped just inches from Sarah, his head bowed in a way no one had ever seen. He was no longer the landlord or the titan of industry. He was a man standing before his creator. He looked up at her, finally breathing air that no longer felt stolen, and saw in her eyes the one thing he never thought he'd deserve, a quiet, tearful nod of welcome. The bell chimed with a clear, melodic ring as Jeremy Adam pushed through the heavy oak doors of the shop. This time, the sound didn't herald a siege or the arrival of a conqueror. It was a simple, humble announcement of a guest. He moved through the narrow, winding aisles with a tentative step, his tailored coat brushing against the rough spines of forgotten histories. The pervasive scent of old paper and aging adhesive was no longer a nuisance to be cleared for a construction crew. It was a sanctuary he had nearly dismantled with his own two hands. Sarah Jake stood exactly where she had been during their first bitter meeting, by the scarred mahogany counter. Her hands, once white-knuckled with silent resistance, now rested peacefully on a stack of poetry volumes. Her gaze remained steady and unblinking, but the steel in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, observant grace. "I didn't come here today to talk about the endowment or the legal filing, Sarah," Jeremy said, his voice stripped of his practiced boardroom edge. He stopped a respectful distance from the counter, feeling the weight of the silence between them. "I came to apologize, not for the business tactics or the bulldozers, but for the man I allowed myself to be while breathing your brother's air. I was using his strength to be a coward." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound folder. Not a legal threat this time, but a promise. "The shop stays. Forever. I've placed the building and the land into a perpetual trust that you alone control. No board of directors, no Adam Heights developers, just you." Sarah looked at the folder, then back at him, and for the first time since they had met, a small, real smile touched her lips. It wasn't a smile of victory, but one of weary relief, like a mother watching a long, dangerous fever finally break in the middle of the night. The tension that had defined Jeremy's posture for 7 years seemed to evaporate under that gaze. "I didn't save you so you could be a king, Jeremy," she whispered, her voice a soft, steady anchor in the quiet room. "I didn't give you his heart so you could build towers of glass that look down on everyone else. I saved you so you could be a man, a real one who knows the value of things that don't have a price tag." Jeremy stood there for a long moment, the hum of the city outside fading into the background. He reached out, his fingers brushing the spine of a fallen volume that had rolled near his feet. He picked it up, a weathered copy of Meditations, and slid it carefully, almost reverently, back into its rightful place on the shelf. The gold leaf on the cover caught the afternoon sun, and Jeremy realized then that he had spent his whole life chasing dividends and square footage, never realizing that kindness was the only investment that never depreciates. For the first time in 7 years, his chest didn't feel tight. He wasn't just surviving, he was finally, truly alive.